Hello everyone, and thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Josh, and I am a member of the SAJFP. We are a group of Jewish anti-Zionists who work to undermine the Zionist structures in South Africa in solidarity with the people of Palestine in the face of their colonial occupation and against their ongoing genocide. And I'm honored to have been invited here today to speak to you all. The work we are doing is so important. We know from our own history as South Africans that our own apartheid would not have fallen were it not for the international pressures placed upon us by foreign nations and institutions in the forms of sanctions, boycotts, and divestment. And we know that these nations and institutions would not have felt so obliged to place these pressures on our country were it not for the tirelessness of student activists in those countries. The Israeli apartheid in occupied Palestine is no different. The work we are doing here today to pressure the institutions we form a part of is of the same significance as those anti-apartheid student activists the world over. Though internally the struggle against the Zionist occupiers is primarily for the Palestinian people to see through to its end, just as the struggle against South African apartheid was primarily one for black and colored South Africans to see to its end. The internal struggle cannot see its end without the external pressure that movements like this play. Just as the South African anti-apartheid struggle needed the external pressure of student activists in order to be seen to its end. Though primarily the work we are doing here today as we move towards a complete academic boycott is material in nature, we must also keep in mind that there is ideological work to do. Zionists have spent decades creating a narrative to justify their atrocities by promoting various myths. Central to this narrative is the myth that anti-Zionism amounts to anti-Semitism. This myth serves to justify the Israeli colonial structure and silence any criticism of it by invoking the specter of the Nazi Party. Additionally, they promote the myth that Jews will never be safe unless Israel exists. This myth is spread to play on the real fears and trauma Jews have held since World War II in order to manufacture consent for the Zionist project. Finally, they promote the myth that Zionism is nothing more than the belief that Jews deserve to have a Jewish state. The point of this myth is to downplay the violence that colonial projects like Zionism always inevitably require. While I am here, I would like to spend a little bit of time to respond to and to refute these myths so that we can all do the ideological work as well. After all, this is a university, and we are here doing some teach-ins today, so I feel this is only appropriate. Let's look at the first myth, that anti-Zionism amounts to anti-Semitism. The corollary of this is, of course, that being a Zionist is a necessary condition for being Jewish. As an anti-Zionist Jew, I have experienced the vitriol of Zionists who endorse this myth. They have told me that I am not really Jewish for not supporting Israel. This myth is perhaps the most dangerous. It has even found itself codified into a bill which has passed the US Senate and will likely become US law when Joe Biden gets the chance to sign it. This myth is the silliest and the easiest to refute. There's a very trivial way to disprove that two things are not one and the same. There is a principle which we can refer to as the non-identity of discernibles. It says basically that if we can discern between two things, then those things are not one and the same. More precisely, it says that for any two things, A and B, if A has some property that B lacks, then A is not identical to B. And we can use this principle to show that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism by showing that the two are discernible, i.e. by showing that one has properties that the other lacks. Additionally, we can give counterexamples to this corollary statement by giving examples of Jewish anti-Zionists in order to show that this corollary is false, and so by extension is the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And these methods are all too easy to utilize. Judaism is a religion, whereas Zionism is not, though many of its adherents seem to treat it like it is. Zionism is a nationalist political movement, whereas Judaism is not. Zionism came into existence in the early 19th century, whereas Judaism is over 3,500 years old. Zionism, like any colonial project, requires mass violence in order to repress indigenous populations, whereas Judaism explicitly condemns violence against innocent people. Zionism requires the coveting of Palestinian land, whereas Judaism explicitly condemns the coveting of other people's property. Judaism has the prohibition on stealing property, even from those who have wronged you, whereas Zionism requires the theft of the land of an entire nation. Judaism explicitly condemns killing, and yet Zionism demands blood. On this point, Hillel, the great Jewish sage, teaches us that whosoever destroys one soul, it is as though he has destroyed the entire world. As such, when Zionists kill 30,000 Palestinians, it is as though they have committed the destruction of 30,000 worlds. This level of mass murder is not permissible under Judaism, and yet it is demanded by the Zionist project. In Judaism, we are forbidden from violating covenants. We are taught that every promise we make is not just a promise to whoever we are making the promise to, it is also a promise that we make to God. In the Talmud, we Jews swore, after being dispelled from Eretz Yisrael a second time, to not retake it by force. As such, Judaism must, if it is to adhere to its own promises and laws, be opposed to the establishment of the contemporary Israeli state, which was done by force. Whereas Zionism is the political basis for this exact establishment by force. For these reasons and more, it is all too apparent that Judaism has features which Zionism lacks, and vice versa. Thus, it is all too obvious that Zionism is not identical to Judaism, and so anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. These arguments have been presented by Jews long before the Zionist movement became popular after World War II. And so there are all too many examples of anti-Zionist Jews in our history. This again adds to the plethora of counter-evidence to this Zionist myth. Let us now turn to the myth that Zionism is nothing more than the belief that a Jewish state has the right to exist. Here we are not investigating whether Jews really do or do not deserve some kind of ethno-state. The answer is no. The idea of an ethno-state should have died in 1945. What we are investigating is whether or not this is really all that Zionism amounts to. The Zionist, when asked, will tell you that they only want a safe Jewish state. But it's all too easy to poke holes in this assertion. One need only ask a Zionist if they would be happy to see a Jewish state on unoccupied land, to see that the mere existence of a Jewish state would not satisfy them. Despite earlier Zionists considering various locations for their ethno-state, including Argentina and what was at the time British East Africa, no modern Zionist would be satisfied with the mere existence of a Jewish state, unless it is a Jewish state in historic Palestine. What if we were to ask the Zionists if they think that the establishment of the Jewish state should cohere with Jewish law and its prohibition on stealing, coveting, and killing? Would the Zionists be satisfied with waiting for a Jewish state to be achieved by peaceful integration? They would not be satisfied with this. This would mean condemning the existence of the Israeli state. Indeed, they know that they cannot occupy the land in historic Palestine by any means other than violence that would comply with Jewish laws, which prohibit killing, theft, and coveting. Nobody is stupid enough to think that indigenous populations will roll over and hand over their land without a fight. Zionists will not wait for the Palestinian people to welcome them into the land, and instead had to take it by force. Thus, Zionism is not merely the belief that Jews deserve an ethno-state. It is not merely the belief that Jews deserve an ethno-state in historic Palestine. It is not merely the belief that Jews deserve an ethno-state in historic Palestine by any means, even if that violates Jewish law. It is the belief that Jews deserve an ethno-state in historic Palestine by any means, and that it must be seized from the river to the sea with speed and urgency at the expense of the indigenous Palestinian population. Never let the Zionists deceive you into thinking they merely want a home. They want to steal the home of others they have killed and downplay the violence of their dispossession with this myth. Let us now look to the final myth, that it is only with the existence of the Israeli state that Jews the world over can be safe. This myth is perhaps the most insidious and difficult to dispute given our history of persecution, but it can be done by careful attention to the tenets of Judaism and to the facts of our history. The Jewish faith teaches us that by making a covenant to follow God's commands, we will be guaranteed protection and delivered to salvation. If this is the case, then it is trivially false that the existence of the Jewish state is required for our safety. Even if God has decided to not keep his promise, we Jews have lived and survived every attempt at our extermination. We even have a joke that we like to tell to summarize each of our holidays. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. We as people have always had the strength to survive, even in the millennia where there was no Jewish state protecting us. Our survival does not depend on the existence of a Jewish state. Moreover, the Israeli state and its machinations actively make Jews unsafe. I've written an article on this and you can find it on the SAJFP website, but the gist of it is this. Israel not only commits various atrocities that any good and peace-loving person should despise, it declares that it commits these atrocities in the name of Jews. To paint any Jew as tacitly in support for the Israeli regime of terror, they paint this deceptive picture that whenever you see a Jew, you are looking at someone in support of the atrocities in occupied Palestine. Israel spreads the messages that Jews are really a people that any good person of conscience should oppose and fear. In other words, Israel propagates anti-Semitism. But this myth is just that, a myth. A genuine commitment to Jewish ethics requires us to oppose this Zionist occupation. Moreover, we as Jews are safe wherever we make our home.
Yes.
I have felt no more integrated and welcomed into my South African community as a Jew, but by the grace of non-Jewish South Africans who have seen the humanity in me in these anti-Zionist spaces. Well, on the other hand, I have felt the ire and hatred of Zionists who would wish me harm. I have been doxxed and threatened and had the police called to my home by Zionists who hate to see one of their own oppose the nationalist rhetoric of Zionism. There is a Yiddish word, doikheit, meaning here-ness. It denotes the idea that we Jews can and should stay wherever we are, alongside people from all different cultures, that we need not escape to a physical homeland of our own in order to thrive as Jews. The safety of the Jewish people does not require a state made up of Zionists who wish me harm and paint me as a monster to be feared by people of good conscience. Our safety requires that we, as Jews, oppose the Zionist structures which paint us as something to be feared and to embrace our doikheit. These are the myths that the Zionists spread to construct their narrative and manufacture consent for genocide. And I hope I've given you some tools today to help you dismantle these myths when you see them. Before I close off, I want to remind us all of the importance of what we are doing here today. We are not only educating ourselves on the nature of these oppressive structures, but we are putting our knowledge that we gain into concrete action. Our praxis here connects us not just to the Palestinian struggle, but all interconnected struggles. The decolonial struggle, the struggle for a habitable climate, the struggle against racism and capitalism and patriarchy and Western hegemony and all other forms of oppression and domination. We cannot separate structures of Zionism from the Western hegemony that needs an ally and foothold in the Middle East for cheap oil, nor the capitalist profit motive that motivates the search for cheap resources and labor. We cannot separate Zionism from the pinkwashing and the instrumentalization of queer people as tools for the Israeli propaganda machine. We cannot separate the genocide from the masses of refugees it creates, or the way that refugee crises are exacerbated by the climate crisis. And we cannot understand the events in our socio-economic environment in isolation. They are all constantly in flux and intertwined with one another. The total liberation of the Palestinian people cannot occur merely by a victory against the Israeli settler colony. It requires the liberation of queer people the world over. It requires the dismantling of the neoliberal capitalist economic world order. It requires the dismantling of Western hegemony. I put it to you all that for Palestine to truly be free, from the river to the sea, we must all truly be free. Let us not rest on whatever victories we have achieved so far, and let us not rest once the Israeli state is finally dismantled. Let us carry on the spirit and energy of our solidarity with the Palestinian people and extend it to all oppressed peoples. My freedom is your freedom. Your freedom is my freedom, and all of our freedom is the freedom of the Palestinian people. From the river to the sea.
Palestine will be free!
From the river to the sea.
Palestine will be free!
Amanda!
Awatu!
Amanda!
Awatu!
Amanda!
Awatu!
Comrades, thank you for having me here today.